It is day 2 of the G20 summit, which kicked off in India's national capital, New Delhi, on Saturday. We saw a slew of bilaterals and key outcomes on day 1 of the summit on the theme, One Family, One Earth and One Future. Well, to talk more on the G20 summit and the bilaterals and the New Delhi declaration, we have with us Ambassador Meera Shankar. She's a former Indian ambassador to the United States of America. Thank you so much for joining us on WION, Ambassador Meera.
My pleasure.
Right, now, Ambassador, it was a power-packed day 1, and we are now on to the second day of the G20 summit. The leaders of the G20, or G21, if I may say, have adopted the New Delhi Declaration. What are some changes that the New Delhi G20 summit has brought on the table?
Look, the biggest challenge was the Ukraine conflict, because the world today is far more divided than it has been over this conflict. And this was making the conclusion of a declaration, the reaching of consensus, extremely difficult. Indeed, all the ministerials so far had failed to come up with a joint statement. Eventually, the Indian team, through some deft diplomacy, was able to get Russia, China, the US, and the Western Bloc to actually agree on common language. And this is language which they all accept without a footnote or without any reservations having been entered or expressed. It focuses on certain universal principles, not to attack the sovereignty or territorial integrity of another state. The threat or use of nuclear weapons are inadmissible. There should be peaceful resolution of conflicts. So there are certain universal principles which have been named, and these have been accepted by all. So that's a major success for India, because many people feared that there may be no declaration. And then it's got very substantive proposals,
right,
and suggestions on accelerating the sustainable development goals, reforming the multilateral development banks, on the green and climate change agenda, including climate finance, on creating and supporting digital public infrastructure, on regulating cryptocurrencies and evolving a policy framework for this, and on women's empowerment. So very substantive developmental aspects have been covered in this declaration. And of course, the emerging economies and developing countries present in the summit, Brazil, South Africa, and others,
absolutely,
were extremely helpful to India in bridging the gap between these two blocs.
Absolutely, Ambassador, you've clearly given an outline of the key outcomes from the day 1 of the summit. But talk to us as to how difficult was it for New Delhi to bring both Russia and China on the same table for the declaration to be adopted by the G20 leaders?
Look, the Western Bloc was insisting that the minimum would have to be the language of the Bali Declaration, which reflected some of the UN resolutions condemning the Russian invasion. And though Russia had entered reservations on this last time, but accepted the overall joint statement, they were not willing to accept it this time, saying that much water has flowed under the bridge. And the situation today is much worse than it was at the time of Bali, because the war has intensified and the Western countries are arming Ukraine with weapons and defense equipment of a much more sophisticated and deadly nature. So it's a far more difficult situation today, and we are not willing to accept at all the same language that we accepted in Bali.
Right,
China, of course, said that you can't put any geopolitical issues in the joint statement, because the G20 is supposed to focus only on economic and developmental and climate change issues. So I think it was an act of diplomatic deftness to bring Russia around. And once Russia, A, the Western Bloc agreed to water down to some extent the Bali language, B, the Russians agreed to accept the language that India had proposed. And once Russia had accepted, China, of course, fell in line because I'm sure they didn't want to be isolated. And their stance was essentially in support of Russia.
Absolutely, Ambassador. Just to follow up to that, do you think that the mention of the Russia-Ukraine war satiates what the US was expecting, or do you think that Washington settled for less?
Look, I think the West was keen that there should be a successful outcome of the Delhi Declaration, and that India's presidency should not be seen as, not delivering. So they were willing to compromise and be pragmatic, recognizing that when you are working on the lowest common denominator between two antagonistic blocs, no side can have their full say. I mean, everybody will be a little dissatisfied.
Also, how do you assess India's message of one Earth, one family, one future resonating with the G20 leaders?
Look, all the issues that were covered in substance in the declaration essentially reflect that theme, because these are global challenges which the world faces. And these challenges don't distinguish between countries on the basis of their ideology. Are you pro-American? Are you pro-Russian, pro-Chinese? No, they will impact everybody in the same way, or maybe in different ways, but they will certainly adversely impact everyone. So it's important that the world comes together to deal with these challenges, which are becoming exceedingly urgent. For instance, let's take the Sustainable Development Goals and the targets which countries had agreed to achieve by 2030. First, because of the COVID, then because of the impact of the Ukraine conflict. Many countries are finding it exceedingly difficult to meet their targets and have fallen behind because interest rates have risen, their debt levels have risen to unsustainable levels. So if we are to help achieve the Sustainable Development Goals, then we need a finance of a different order of magnitude. Now, at the same time, climate change and prevention of global warming is exceedingly compelling. You've seen this year in India, temperatures of over 46 degrees for sustained periods of time. Europe and the US have been burning with high temperatures, forest fires, and all kinds of adverse weather events. So it's absolutely clear that if we don't act, we don't really have a future. Here again, the least developed countries need finance to enable them to handle this transition and also to adapt to the adverse consequences of climate change. So one of the proposals that India has made, and there's this expert group report by N.K. Singh and Larry Summers, is how to reform the international development institutions, the World Bank, the IMF, how to ensure that more funding is available to the World Bank. For instance, the endorsement of the change in the capital adequacy ratio of the bank could release $200 billion extra per year in terms of funding. And they have also suggested that the World Bank should be able to use more leverage, that is, to actually loan more and not necessarily be so cautious, because these are sovereign countries. The debt is not going to run away. So and then also to access capital markets or to provide adjacencies to capital markets, which help increase the total basket of funding available. So these are very substantive ideas. And going forward, this is what the world is going to need to be able to deal with these challenges. Similarly, if you take the area of health, Now, for instance, the
Ambassador, I just want
WHO.
to interject here that you have really outlined the challenges and the outcomes of the G20 summit. But apart from the diplomatic talks, India's soft power is also at display. Talk to us more on that.
Look, I think that, when I was ambassador in yoga, there were 20 million Americans who were doing yoga every day, even though they didn't necessarily associate it with India.
Right.
But it was extremely popular and more. Now, today, I'm told the figure may almost have doubled. So you can see how that, has grown. Similarly, when I went to Germany, I found that there were Bollywood disco nights, which had become quite popular in Germany.
Right.
And so I used to always joke and say that I should have learned Bollywood dancing before coming as ambassador. So you can see that India's soft power has an appeal across the world, and that has been on display throughout the G20 summit, from cuisine to performances to art and creativity. I think that's been there, very much there.
Absolutely, Ambassador. We saw India's soft power and its culture right throughout the weekend, right here in India's national capital. But thanks very much for joining us on WION and sharing insights with us on the G20 summit.
Thank you.
Thank you.